Every model in the vault would have sold her soul for a single glance from the Korean Mafia boss. The black photographer he couldn't stop watching wanted to put him in a body bag. He knew. He hired her anyway. Shoots at the vault didn't just happen, they consumed. The most exclusive photography studio in the city was a sensory assault. Industrial strobes fired in rhythmic bursts, turning the air white-hot, then plunging it back into violet shadow. The ozone stung your nostrils before the perfume hit that thick, cloying musk of a dozen competing fragrances, each one costing more than rent, each one worn like a weapon. Fog machines pumped low-hanging clouds across the concrete floor, and the click-click-click of shutter releases echoed off the steel rafters like the ticking of a clock no one had set but everyone obeyed. Every woman who stepped onto that studio floor came wanting something. A campaign, a cover, a career-defining frame. But what they really wanted, what made their spines straighten and their smiles turn desperate, was Roh Dae-Jung. He sat in the black leather chair at the far end of the studio, not a director's chair, a throne. His posture was relaxed in the way only truly dangerous men could afford. Legs crossed at the ankle, one tattooed hand resting on the armrest, the other raised to his jaw, fingers curled loosely against his lips. He wore a charcoal gray suit so precisely tailored it looked poured onto his frame. Beneath it, a black button-down shirt, open one button too many, revealing the geometric ink that crawled up his neck like living calligraphy. The tattoos coiled across the backs of both hands, disappearing beneath heavy platinum rings that caught the strobe light and threw it back in cold flashes. His eyes were the color of black amber, ancient, sharp, and utterly still. He didn't look like a man who owned a photography studio. He looked like an apex predator who had learned to wear high fashion as a second skin, the kind of man who had run out of things to fear so long ago that fear itself had forgotten his name. The models orbited him. They posed harder when his gaze swept the room. They laughed louder during breaks, tossing hair over bare shoulders, adjusting the intricate lace and gold embroidery of their gowns with fingers that trembled just enough to betray the performance. They were stunning, every one of them draped in couture that blurred the line between clothing and architecture. But their beauty was frantic, hungry. They circled Dae-Jung the way moths circle a flame, not understanding that the heat they craved was the very thing designed to incinerate them. Dae-Jung looked through them like they were smoke. Power was routine, adoration was noise. Then there was Crystal Gilmore. 4 months she had worked behind his lens. 4 months, and she had never once looked at him with anything other than ice-cold, surgical indifference. She moved through the organized chaos of the studio floor with a brutal efficiency that made the assistants scramble out of her path. Her hair was pulled up in a natural textured afro puff that added 3 inches to her height and framed a face that could have been carved from obsidian beautiful. Yes, but in the way a blade is beautiful. Functional, unforgiving. Her attire screamed function over fashion. A black tactical vest strapped tight over a fitted black t-shirt, the pouches stuffed with memory cards, batteries, lens caps, and equipment that bulged in ways that looked less like photography gear and more like ammunition. Black cargo pants, black boots, laced tight to the ankle. She held her Canon DSLR not the way artists hold cameras, not cradled, not cherished, but the way a soldier holds a rifle, low, stabilized, posture braced. Her finger rested on the shutter release the way a sniper's finger rests on the trigger, patient, precise, and ready to fire at the exact fraction of a second that would capture something no one else could see. She never smiled at the models. She never flinched at the gangsters who occasionally drifted through the studio's back halls. She never not once adjusted her hair, her vest, or her expression when Dae-Jung's gaze landed on her. She simply worked, frame after frame after frame. A machine wrapped in dark skin and silence. Her indifference cut through the noise of the studio louder than any strobe flash or barked direction. Dae-Jung told himself it was professional curiosity, a strategic interest in the photographer who refused to perform. Every other person in the vault existed in relation to him, orbiting, fearing, wanting. Crystal Gilmore existed in relation to the lens, only the lens, as if he were just another object in the frame, no more significant than a light stand or a backdrop clamp. It felt disturbingly like fascination. He watched her now, tracking her movements over the knuckles pressed to his lips. She was adjusting the angle on a key light, her jaw set, her eyes reading the fall of shadow across a model's collarbone with the detached precision of a surgeon examining an X-ray. The model, a 6-foot blonde in a gown that probably cost more than a sedan, was trying desperately to catch Crystal's eye, to establish some kind of rapport, some warmth. Crystal gave her nothing. She checked the exposure, fired 3 frames, and moved on without a word. Then it happened. A commotion erupted near the studio's loading dock entrance. A man thick-necked, red-faced, reeking of cheap cologne and cheaper ambition, had bluffed his way past the first security checkpoint with a press badge that looked like it had been printed at a copy shop. He was a paparazzi freelancer, the worst breed, aggressive, entitled, and stupid enough to think that getting a candid shot of Dae-Jung inside the vault would make his career instead of ending his life. He burst through the side door with his camera raised, already firing frames, his mouth running. Dae-Jung! Dae-Jung! One shot, just one shot for the... Dae-Jung's security detail moved. 3 men in black, fast and fluid, converging from different angles. But Crystal was closer. She didn't look up from her camera. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. She simply pivoted on her back foot, closed the distance in 2 strides, and moved. It was a blur of violence so clean it was almost clinical. She caught the man's camera arm at the wrist, redirected his momentum, and used his own weight to fold him forward. Her knee drove into his solar plexus, not hard enough to break anything, just hard enough to empty every molecule of oxygen from his lungs. The man's camera clattered to the floor. His knees followed. Crystal caught the camera before it hit concrete a second time, checked the memory card slot with practiced fingers, and popped the card out. She pocketed it. Then she straightened her tactical vest, adjusted a lens cap, and looked at Dae-Jung's approaching security team with an expression that said, "He's your problem now." The entire exchange took 4 seconds. The studio had gone dead silent. Models froze mid-pose. Assistants stood with reflectors hanging limp at their sides. Even the fog machines seemed to pause. In the shadow of his chair, Roh Dae-Jung's mouth curved. It was not his usual expression, not the polished, controlled mask he wore for business, not the bored indifference he offered to the world. This was something else, something feral, something that had teeth. He didn't want a model. He didn't want an artist. He wanted the wolf in the tactical vest. His head of security, Park, materialized at his shoulder. Should we retrieve the memory card from the photographer? Dae-Jung didn't look away from Crystal. No. Find out everything about the wrist lock she used. That wasn't self-defense training. That was institutional. I want to know which institution. What Dae-Jung couldn't see what Crystal's perfect mask concealed behind that stone-carved expression was the fire burning in her chest. She wasn't straightening her vest out of habit. She was pressing her hand flat against her ribs to slow her heartbeat, to smother the adrenaline before it reached her face. Crystal Gilmore wasn't at the vault to take pictures. She was there to prove that Roh Dae-Jung was the sculptor, the serial killer who had been vanishing models from studios and agencies across 3 boroughs for the past 2 years. Women who disappeared from the industry without a trace, only to surface weeks later in anonymous gallery exhibitions, posed, preserved, and displayed like art installations. Dead, beautiful, and arranged with a photographer's eye for composition that made the crime scenes look like editorial spreads from a magazine published in hell. She checked her watch. 6:14 p.m. The Thursday evening shoot was winding down. The crew would be dismissed by 7. The skeleton lighting team would stay to break down equipment. And then, like every Thursday for the past 4 months, the ritual would begin. Former forensic photographer for the Bureau, disgraced, discarded, blacklisted after she'd refused to alter evidence in a case that would have embarrassed the wrong people. Now working off the books, deep undercover, running an investigation that no agency would sanction and no court would authorize. 4 months she had spent building the profile from the inside. She'd cataloged every anomaly. She'd tracked the chemical supply orders, industrial-grade fixative and preservation compounds in quantities no legitimate studio would ever need. She'd mapped the blind spots in the vault's camera system, the dead zones that someone had designed with surgical precision, leaving exactly one corridor unmonitored, the one leading to the restricted basement levels. She'd noted the way certain models looked at Dae-Jung not with fear, not with desire, but with a strange, uncomfortable gratitude, as if they owed him something that couldn't be spoken aloud. Every piece of evidence she had assembled pointed to the man in the charcoal suit, especially Thursday nights. At 7:17 p.m., like clockwork, after the last crew member filed out and the studio floor emptied to its skeleton staff, Roh Dae-Jung would rise from his chair. He would button his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who answered to no schedule but his own. He would scan the studio one final time, and then he would disappear into the restricted basement. No security escort, no cameras. Just him and whatever waited in the dark below. When he returned, sometimes 20 minutes later, sometimes an hour, the faint chemical scent of bleach and developing fluid would cling to the fibers of his tailored suit, the smell of a dark room, or the smell of evidence being dissolved. Tonight was Thursday. Crystal felt the weight of the stolen keycard pressing against her hip, tucked inside the lining of her cargo pants. Tonight she wouldn't just observe. Tonight she was going down. She was going to find the room. She was going to photograph whatever was in it, and she was going to end the reign of the iron lens. She risked a glance toward the chair. Dae-Jung was staring directly at her. The breath caught in her throat like a fishhook. His gaze was heavy, physical, tangible, pressing against the back of her skull like a palm. Those black amber eyes held something she couldn't quite decode. Not suspicion, not desire. Something older, something patient. Does he know? No. Predators were arrogant. He didn't see an agent. He saw a puzzle. A photographer who refused to worship at the altar of his power. An interesting variable in an otherwise predictable equation. She forced herself to look away first. The crew was breaking down the main set. The models were drifting toward the dressing rooms. The studio was emptying, the energy draining from the space like heat from a cooling engine. She busied herself with equipment breaking down her camera rig, coiling cables, storing memory cards in labeled cases with the methodical precision of a woman who understood that covers were maintained in the small things. By 7 p.m., the main crew was gone. The lighting assistants were finishing the last of the breakdown, working in the quiet efficiency of people who wanted to go home. The studio floor had lost its electric charge without the strobes firing and the fog machines running and the models performing. The vault was just a warehouse, cold concrete, steel beams, shadows pooling in the corners where the remaining work lights couldn't reach. Crystal positioned herself behind the wardrobe partition on the studio's south side, a vantage point that kept her outside the field of view of cameras 7 and 12 while maintaining a line of sight to the corridor. Entrance. She had mapped every one of these angles, timed every sweep pattern, calculated every blind spot over the course of 93 separate observation sessions. She had done it without notes, without a phone, without any recording device that could be found in a search. She had done it in her head, using the same spatial temporal memory that had made her the Bureau's best forensic reconstructionist. Camera 7, fixed wide angle, covering the south entrance. Camera 12, pan-tilt zoom, sweeping the east corridor on a 45-second cycle. The dead zone, the gap in coverage between Camera 12's eastward sweep and Camera 19's westward pan lasted 11 seconds. Enough to cross 30 feet of hallway and reach the restricted door if she moved with purpose. The map was complete. The gaps were confirmed. The route was set. 7:17 p.m. As if the universe itself operated on his schedule, Dae-Jung stood. He buttoned his jacket, a single button. Center, charcoal fabric pulling smooth across his shoulders. He let his gaze sweep the studio one final time, lingering on nothing, lingering on everything. The scan paused, for a fraction of a second, on Crystal's empty station. On the camera sitting neatly on the equipment cart. On the absence of the woman who should have been standing behind it. Then he turned and walked toward the restricted corridor, his platinum rings catching the last of the work lights before the shadows swallowed him whole. Crystal counted to 10. She set her camera down on the equipment cart with deliberate care, the way you set down a weapon you expect to pick up again very soon. Changing a memory card, she murmured to the lighting assistant without looking at him. She slipped off the studio floor, moving through the gaps between light stands and backdrop frames, her boots silent on the concrete. The restricted corridor was 30 feet ahead. The stolen keycard was in her hand. She had lifted it from Park's backup set during a triggered false alarm on the fire suppression system 3 weeks ago. 90 seconds of chaos. 90 seconds was all she'd needed. She had cloned the card that same night and returned the original before the next shift change. She reached the corridor at 7:17 and 31 seconds. Camera 12 was mid-sweep, lens pointed away 7 seconds of invisibility. She moved fast. The restricted door waited at the end, gunmetal gray. No window, no handle, just the reader and a small red LED. She pressed the keycard. The LED turned green. The lock disengaged with a sound like a bone snapping clean. The door swung inward, exhaling cold air that smelled of servers, recycled atmosphere, and something chemical. She was the hunter. She was the law. She was closing the trap. Crystal stepped into the dark. The stairwell descended steeply, lit only by emergency strips at ankle height. At the bottom, a longer corridor. The chemical smell intensified formaldehyde, she identified now, mixed with ozone. The walls were lined with thick cables feeding into junction boxes. This wasn't a basement. This was infrastructure, purpose-built. The corridor ended at a second door heavier, reinforced, with a biometric reader. It was already open, 3 inches ajar, a sliver of blue light painting a line across the floor. An invitation. Or a trap. She pushed the door open. The room was large. 8 monitors mounted in 2 rows on the far wall, each displaying a high-resolution feed. A curved workstation sat beneath them. The chair was occupied. Roh Dae-Jung sat facing the monitors with his back to her. He didn't turn around. "You're early," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, stripped of the authority he wielded upstairs. "I expected you at 7:20. You usually take longer to clear camera 12's sweep. You've been getting faster, more confident. That's either impressive or careless." The ice in Crystal's veins was instantaneous. Not fear, the crystalline clarity of realizing every assumption you've built your operation on has just been detonated. "You've been watching me map the cameras." Now he turned. The chair swiveled slowly, his face emerging from the blue light. The tattoos, the jaw, the black amber eyes that pinned her like a specimen. "I've been watching everything, Agent Gilmore. Welcome back, my fierce hearts and midnight dreamers. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our little dark romance family stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you leave here helps us keep unraveling these dangerous love stories and high-stakes betrayals together. So find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready. Let's begin." The name hit her like a round to the chest plate, her classified operational designation, the name that existed in exactly one file, behind encryption civilian operations weren't supposed to break. Dae-Jung pressed a key on the console. All 8 monitors shifted. The first showed her apartment, not the cover apartment, the real one. The safe house in Bushwick maintained under a fabricated identity. The second showed the interior of her car, shot from a pinhole camera near the rearview mirror, her face on screen, reviewing case files in the driver's seat. The third showed her entering a storage unit in Red Hook. The fourth, a meeting with a retired forensic contact. The 5th through 8th showed her inside the vault every movement, every moment she'd spent mapping blind spots and timing sweep patterns. She watched herself on screen, moving with what she'd believed was invisible precision, and the realization that she'd been documented for the entire duration of her operation landed on her chest like concrete. 4 months, Dae-Jung said, standing with the slow deliberation of a large predator that has no need to hurry. You have been building a case against me for 4 months. Your methodology is exceptional. The Bureau was stupid to lose you. He stepped toward her. Crystal's hand went to the compact Glock concealed beneath her vest, but the geometry was wrong. The open door behind her. No security personnel. His calm, almost respectful tone. This wasn't what an ambush looked like. I read your file the day your portfolio landed on my desk, he said, stopping 6 feet away. The real file. The one Director Marcus Webb personally classified after he destroyed your career for refusing to falsify evidence. You bugged my apartment, Crystal said. Her voice was flat, operational. You've had me under surveillance. Since before you applied. Since I learned a disgraced bureau photographer was constructing a cover identity sophisticated enough to survive a Giamin background check. He let the silence settle. You think I'm the sculptor. You think I've been killing those women, preserving them, displaying them. Crystal said nothing. Her hand stayed on the Glock. Dae-Jung's expression shifted. The amusement drained, replaced by something she hadn't expected: exhaustion. Deep, marrow-level fatigue. Come with me. There's something you need to see. He turned his back on her deliberately, presenting the full width of his shoulders to a woman with a concealed firearm, and walked toward a recessed door she hadn't noticed. He pressed his thumb to a biometric pad. The lock clicked, and beyond it, Crystal's entire investigation collapsed. It was not a laboratory, not a kill room. It was an apartment complex. The sublevel opened into a wide, well-lit corridor with finished drywall painted in warm, neutral tones, framed photographs on the walls. Doors lined both sides at intervals suggesting individual living quarters, carpeted floors, soft, warm white lighting. The air carried the domestic scents of cooking food and laundry detergent. Crystal heard voices, women's voices. Through an open doorway, a woman in sweatpants stood at a kitchen counter cutting vegetables. She looked up and nodded at Dae-Jung with comfortable familiarity, then regarded Crystal with caution. Crystal recognized her. Mireille Duval, French-Algerian, 24, vanished from a fitting in Chelsea 18 months ago, classified as probable homicide. Her photograph was pinned to Crystal's evidence board. She was standing in a kitchen, cutting carrots. Another door opened. A tall, dark-skinned woman with close-cropped hair emerged carrying folded towels. She saw Dae-Jung and smiled, not the desperate smile of the models upstairs. A real smile. Tired. Grateful. The smile of someone who felt safe. Adaize Okonkwo disappeared from Tribeca 14 months ago. Presumed dead. Door after door. Face after face. Crystal recognized them with devastating precision. Yuki Tanaka, Catalina Reyes, Lin Zhao, Sofia Petrov, Nadia Ose, Aisling Murphy. 8 women the world believed had been murdered by the sculptor. Alive, cooking dinner, folding laundry. Living in a hidden complex beneath the vault, protected by a man the FBI had profiled as a serial killer. Crystal's hands were at her sides. They were trembling not with fear but with the seismic shift of a worldview being rebuilt from the foundation. You didn't kill them. Dae-Jung leaned against the corridor wall and crossed his arms. His expression was unreadable, just the ancient, amber-eyed patience of a man who had waited 4 months for this moment. No, I saved them. He let the silence carry the weight. Then he pushed off the wall. These women were targeted, specifically. Selected from agency rosters, background checked, assessed for isolation women with limited family connections who wouldn't be missed quickly. There is a trafficking ring operating in the fashion industry. Agent Gilmore, high level, well-funded, embedded in places you haven't looked because you've been too busy looking at me. He paused and held her gaze. The ring is run by someone inside the agency that employed you, someone with access to federal databases and witness protection protocols. I faked their deaths. I created the crime scenes, the poses, the preservation techniques. I made the sculptor a ghost story terrifying enough to keep law enforcement focused on a serial killer who doesn't exist, while the real predators continued to operate inside the institutions you trust. In the cold silence of the restricted hallway, Roh Dae-Jung paused at the steel door. He did not look back. He pressed 2 fingers to the comm piece nested inside his right ear. "She's moving," the voice of his head of security low and taut over the encrypted channel. "Coming down the east corridor. She has the keycard. Should we intercept?" Dae-Jung stared at the reinforced door. Behind it, 8 monitors displayed the faces of the women he had spent 3 years hiding, models who the world believed were dead, who the trafficking ring embedded inside the bureau had marked for sale, who were alive and breathing in the sub-level safe rooms because he had faked their deaths with the same artistic precision that made the FBI call him a serial killer. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, dark, quiet, almost sad. Crystal Gilmore thought she was invisible. She thought she was the predator, stalking her prey through the tall grass with a forensic photographer's patience and a profiler's ruthless eye. She had no idea that he had read her bureau file the day her portfolio landed on his desk. He knew about the FBI. He knew about the evidence she'd refused to falsify. He knew about the disgrace that followed the career assassination orchestrated by the very man she still called her mentor. He knew she believed he was a monster. He had hired her anyway. Not to silence her, not to toy with her, but because the trafficking ring had a mole inside his own operation, and he needed the sharpest forensic eye the Bureau had ever produced to find it. Crystal Gilmore was the only person alive angry enough, skilled enough, and broken enough to see what his own people couldn't. "Let her in," Dae-Jung whispered into the comm. He pushed open the steel door. The darkness breathed out cold air and the hum of servers. "Kill the cameras on sub-level 3. He stepped inside and let the shadows take him. "Come on, Agent Gilmore," he murmured to the empty corridor behind him. "Show me what you see through that lens." Somewhere above, Crystal Gilmore pressed the stolen keycard to the reader. The light turned green. The lock disengaged with a sound like a bone snapping. She stepped into the dark, and the shutter clicked both ways. The proof came in layers, the way all devastating truths do, not as a single blow but as an accumulation of weight that bends the spine one vertebra at a time until something finally snaps. Dae-Jung laid it out on the monitor wall with the methodical patience of a man who had been assembling this case longer than Crystal had been alive in his world. He didn't narrate. He didn't editorialize. He simply pressed keys and let the screens speak, because the screens spoke in a language Crystal understood better than anyone breathing. Evidence. Financial records first. Wire transfers routed through 14 shell companies across 6 jurisdictions, each one peeling back to a single origin point, a discretionary fund buried inside the Bureau's operational budget, authorized by one signature, Marcus Webb. The amounts were precise, clinical. 40,000 here, 65,000 there, never round numbers. Round numbers attracted auditors. Marcus knew that. Marcus had taught Crystal that, in fact, during a seminar on forensic accounting in her 2nd year at the Bureau. She remembered his voice. "The smart ones never use round numbers, Gilmore. Remember that when you're building a financial trail." He had been teaching her to catch criminals. He had been teaching her from experience. Then the communications. Encrypted messages recovered from a server Dae-Jung's people had compromised 18 months ago, a server operated by the consortium that purchased the women. The messages were sterile, transactional, stripped of anything resembling humanity. Model designations replaced by inventory numbers, delivery windows, condition requirements. And threading through every exchange, a handler identified only by a code name, developer. Crystal read the messages on the monitor and felt the chemical taste of bile climbing the back of her throat because the operational language was Bureau standard, the syntax, the abbreviation patterns. The way information was compartmentalized into need-to-know tiers. Whoever developer was, they had been trained by the same institution that had trained her. Dae-Jung pulled up the final layer. Metadata analysis. His people had cross-referenced the timestamps of every communication from developer with the access logs of the Bureau's secure terminal network. The correlation was absolute. Every message sent by developer originated during Windows when exactly one senior official was logged into the system. Every single one. 114 messages over 3 years. 114 timestamps. One name on the access log. Marcus Webb. Crystal's eyes caught the date on the earliest message. 3 years ago, a full year before the first disappearance she had tracked. The operation had been running 12 months before she had even noticed women were vanishing. Marcus had been selling targets to the consortium for a year before the sculptor's crime scenes began appearing, which meant the first wave of victims had simply vanished without theater, without staged poses, without anyone connecting the dots. It was only when Dae-Jung began faking deaths, creating the elaborate posed crime scenes to make the world believe the women were dead, that a pattern emerged. The sculptor wasn't a killer's signature. It was a protector's camouflage. And Marcus had been operating in the dark for a year before the camouflage even existed. Crystal stood in the blue light of the monitor room and stared at the evidence the way she had once stared at crime scenes with the cold, dissecting focus of a woman trained to see patterns in chaos. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. For a long time longer than Dae-Jung expected, longer than the silence had any right to last in a room humming with servers and the low-frequency pulse of encrypted data streams. She simply stood there, her hands at her sides, her breathing slow and controlled, and let the architecture of everything she had believed collapse floor by floor inside her chest. 7 years. 7 years she had given the Bureau. 7 years of crime scenes that would have broken lesser minds, of evidence catalogued with surgical precision, of photographs taken in rooms where the smell of death was so thick it became a texture you could feel on your skin. She had given the Bureau her 20s, her sleep, her capacity for casual human connection, and the part of herself that used to believe the world was a place where effort and integrity produced justice. She had given all of that to an institution that had, in return, allowed the man who ran it to sell women like inventory. The profiler in her screamed for an alternative explanation, some elegant counter-theory that would rescue her understanding of the world, some fracture in the evidence chain that would let her believe Marcus Webb was being framed. She searched for it with the ruthless thoroughness she brought to everything. She found nothing. The evidence was clean, comprehensive, airtight. It was the kind of case she would have been proud to build, and it pointed to the man who had made her. She became aware that her hands were shaking again, not the adrenaline tremor from the paparazzi takedown. This was something deeper, a tectonic vibration that started in the marrow and worked its way outward, the physical manifestation of a foundation being demolished. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and willed the shaking to stop. It didn't stop. She pressed harder. "How long have you known?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped bare. 14 months, Dae-Jung said. He was standing at the far end of the workstation, his arms crossed, the tattoos on his hands disappearing into the charcoal folds of his sleeves. "I identified the pattern after Ade's Okonkwo. The timing of her exposure to the consortium was too precise. Someone with access to my client database was feeding her location, her schedule, her security gaps. I traced it outward. It led to the Bureau. It led to him." He paused. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not pain, exactly, but the shadow of it. The memory of failure. "I couldn't save them all," he said. "The first year, before I understood what was happening, 6 women were taken, sold, gone before I even knew the pipeline existed. By the time I built the safe frame operation, the staged deaths, the hidden complex, the infrastructure to make women disappear before the consortium could reach them, 6 were already beyond my reach." His jaw tightened. "The 8 women downstairs are the ones I got to in time. The 6 I didn't, their files are in the system too. I track them. I haven't stopped looking. But the consortium moves them across borders faster than I can follow, and every lead I've found has been a dead end fed to me by the same mole who's been selling my information to Webb. 14 women, 6 lost, 8 saved. The math was simple, the weight of it was not. And the mole inside your organization? Still active, Still feeding web information from inside my operation. That's why I needed you. He held her gaze. Your profiler's eye. Your ability to read behavior, to see the fracture lines in loyalty that other people miss. I've watched you catalog my entire crew over 4 months, the way they move, the way they speak to each other, the micro-expressions they wear when they think no one is watching. You've already built profiles on every person in this building. I need you to tell me which one is lying. Crystal looked at the monitors. 8 women alive below the studio, 6 more somewhere in the dark, beyond reach. 114 messages from a man she had called her mentor. A Korean Mafia boss asking a disgraced federal agent to save his people from the institution that had destroyed her. The world had been one thing when she woke up this morning. Now it was something else entirely. And the woman standing in the blue light was someone new, someone who didn't have a name yet but was being forged in the space between betrayal and fury. She closed her eyes, drew a breath. When she opened them, the shaking in her hands had stopped. Not because the pain had passed, but because something colder had moved in beneath it, something with edges, something that cut and the cold had steadied her the way rage steadies a blade. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone vibrated. Not the burner she used for the investigation. Her personal phone. The one she kept powered down and locked in the interior pocket of her vest. The one that only 3 people in the world had the number for. She pulled it out. The screen showed a blocked caller ID and a single text message, 4 words long. I know where you are. Crystal's stomach dropped. The phone was supposed to be off. Had been off. Which meant someone with access to cellular infrastructure had forced a remote activation, pinged the device, woken it, and used it as a beacon. That wasn't a gangster's trick. That was a federal capability. The kind of tool that required authorization codes and institutional access. The kind of tool that Director Marcus Webb could deploy with a phone call. But Marcus couldn't have known she was in the sub-level. Not unless someone inside the vault, someone inside Dae-Jung's operation had told him. The mole. Crystal's eyes met Dae-Jung's across the blue-lit room, and she saw in his expression that he had arrived at the same conclusion in the same instant. The mole wasn't just feeding information to the consortium. The mole was watching them right now. The mole had seen Crystal follow Dae-Jung into the restricted basement, and the mole had made a call. The fluorescent lights in the sub-level corridor buzzed once and went dark. Crystal's training kicked in before her conscious mind finished processing the shift. She dropped to a low crouch, her right hand closing around the grip of the Glock beneath her vest, her left hand killing the phone screen to eliminate the light source. In the sudden blackness, she heard Dae-Jung move not panicked, not rushed, just the controlled displacement of a man repositioning in the dark, with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this scenario. "East stairwell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." They moved through the sub-level corridor by memory, Crystal counting steps, Dae-Jung navigating by touch along the wall. The emergency lighting had been killed remotely, which meant the mole had access to the building's electrical infrastructure. Someone senior, someone trusted, someone Dae-Jung had never suspected, or had suspected and dismissed, because loyalty had blinded him the same way institutional faith had blinded Crystal. They reached the east stairwell and climbed. At the top, Dae-Jung pressed his ear to the door, listened for 3 seconds, then pushed it open. The studio floor of the vault was empty. The strobes were cold, the fog machines silent. But the loading dock door was open, and standing in the rectangle of yellow streetlight that poured through the gap was a figure Crystal would have recognized in absolute darkness, by silhouette alone. Director Marcus Webb. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, not bureau agents, not law enforcement, but private contractors with the flat eyes and squared shoulders of people who solved problems that couldn't appear in official reports. Marcus himself looked exactly as she remembered him. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a navy overcoat that probably cost more than the monthly salary he'd earned when he was still pretending to be a public servant. His face carried the expression she had seen 1,000 times in briefing rooms, calm, authoritative, the practiced mask of a man who believed he controlled every variable in the equation. He had arrived too fast. Crystal noted this with the clinical detachment of a profiler clocking evidence in real time. The text message, the power kill, and Marcus standing in the loading dock all within minutes. He had been close, staged, waiting for the signal from his asset inside Dae-Jung's operation. The mole hadn't just tipped him off tonight. The mole had been coordinating this for days, maybe weeks. Marcus had known Crystal would eventually follow Dae-Jung into the basement. He had been patient enough to wait for the moment, and the mole had been positioned to deliver it. Crystal. His voice echoed across the empty studio floor, warm, paternal. The voice of a mentor greeting a protege. I was hoping we could have a conversation before this got complicated. Crystal stepped onto the studio floor with the Glock at her side, finger indexed along the frame, muzzle pointed at the concrete. Dae-Jung remained 2 steps behind her, a shadow in charcoal. You've been selling them, Crystal said. No preamble, no warmth. The flat voice of a profiler delivering a finding. The models. You've been selling their locations to the consortium. 14 that we know of, probably more. Marcus tilted his head, a gesture she recognized, the one he used when he was about to deliver a performance disguised as candor. You've been spending too much time underground, Crystal. The man behind you is a syndicate boss with a documented body count. Whatever he's shown you down there, whatever story he's constructed, it's designed to turn you. That's what men like him do. They find the broken ones, and they offer them a new religion. I've seen the wire transfers, the encrypted communications, the metadata correlation. Your terminal access logs match every message from developer. Every single one, Marcus. 114. Something shifted behind Marcus's eyes. A fracture in the mask, hairline thin, visible only to someone trained to look for exactly that kind of micro-expression. Crystal was trained. She saw it, and in the fraction of a second it took for Marcus to reconstruct his composure, she knew with absolute certainty that every piece of evidence on Dae-Jung's monitors was real. Marcus's hand moved inside his overcoat. Crystal saw the draw before it happened, the subtle shift of weight to his back foot, the rotation of his shoulder, the way his elbow tucked against his ribs to clear the fabric. She was already moving when the gun came out, already pivoting to present her vest the thickest part, the trauma plate when the muzzle flash lit the empty studio like a strobe firing one last time. The round hit her center mass. The impact was enormous, a sledgehammer blow that drove the air from her lungs and sent her staggering backward into an equipment cart. She went down. Her back hit the concrete. The ceiling spun above her in a blur of steel beams and dead lights. Pain radiated outward from her sternum in concentric waves, hot and deep, the kind that collapses your field of vision to a single point of white. But the vest held. The trauma plate caught the round and spread the kinetic energy across 12 square inches of ballistic material, converting a lethal impact into a massive bruise that would turn her entire chest purple by morning. She was alive. She couldn't breathe, but she was alive. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Marcus's voice not speaking to her, but into a phone, rapid and clipped. This is Director Webb, authorization code 77 Alpha. I need an emergency alert issued immediately. Crystal Gilmore, former bureau asset, wanted for attempted murder of a federal official. Consider armed and extremely dangerous. Citywide distribution. All agencies. By the time Crystal dragged enough air into her lungs to sit up, Marcus and his contractors were gone. The loading dock door was closing. And somewhere in the digital infrastructure of every law enforcement agency in the tri-state area, her name and photograph were propagating through alert systems like a virus, a disgraced agent, now a fugitive, wanted for a crime committed against her by the man who had framed her. Dae-Jung was beside her. His hands were on her vest, checking the impact site with the practiced assessment of someone who had evaluated gunshot trauma before. His face was close to hers, and in the darkness of the dead studio, his black-amber eyes held something she hadn't seen in them until now. Anger. Real anger. The quiet, compressed fury of a man whose control was a choice, not a limitation. "Can you move?" Crystal coughed, tasted copper, nodded. She checked the time. 8:23 p.m. The confrontation with Marcus had taken less than 10 minutes. The city was still awake, the streets still full, the law enforcement response still assembling. "Then we need to go," Dae-Jung said. "He's just put a target on you that every badge in the city can see. We have maybe 15 minutes before this building is surrounded." They had 12. Crystal spent them in the sub-level, moving through the hidden apartment complex with Dae-Jung's senior lieutenant, a woman named Seo-Yoon, who moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had executed evacuation protocols before briefing the 8. Women enclipped, urgent sentences, secure locations, extraction routes, timelines. The women moved without panic. They had been living under the threat of discovery for months, some of them for years. They knew the drill. They had go-bags packed and identification documents prepared. They were survivors, and survivors don't waste time asking questions when the alarms sound. By the time Crystal climbed back to the studio level, she could hear the distant percussion of helicopter rotors and the wailing harmonics of multiple sirens converging from different compass points. Through the loading dock window, she could see the strobing blue and red of police vehicles establishing a perimeter 3 blocks out. And then Dae-Jung told her his plan. She didn't agree with it. She argued against it with the cold, logical precision of a profiler who understood that the plan's success depended on a variable that couldn't be controlled. The restraint of a SWAT team confronting a known syndicate boss. The argument lasted 45 seconds. It ended when Dae-Jung removed his jacket, folded it once, and handed it to her. "The Harrington Gala at the Metropolitan is already underway," he said. 300 guests, press coverage from every major outlet. Federal agents won't breach a room full of cameras and civilians they'll contain, negotiate, and process. That gives you a window, 3 hours minimum before they move me to a transport. Take the service tunnel from sub-level 2. It exits on Gansfort, south side. My car will be waiting. They'll arrest you. Yes. They'll put you in a federal transport. Maximum security. You won't see daylight for Crystal. His voice cut through her objection like a blade through gauze. Quiet. Final. It was the first time he had used her first name without the title, without agent. Just her name, spoken with the weight of a man who had stopped seeing her as an asset and started seeing her as something he hadn't expected to find in the wreckage of his war. "I have spent 3 years protecting those women. I have built an operation designed to survive my absence. What I have not built is a way to stop Marcus Webb, because I cannot get close enough without triggering every alarm in the federal system." He held her gaze. "You can. You're the only one who can. But not from inside a cell. So I am going to walk into that gala, and I am going to let them take me, and you are going to do what I hired you to do." He extended his hand. Not for a handshake. Palm up. Open. An offering. Crystal looked at his hand, at the Giamin tattoos covering the knuckles, at the platinum rings catching the last of the light bleeding through the loading dock windows, at the hand of a man who was about to trade his freedom for hers, not because she had earned his trust, but because the 8 women in the sub-level had earned his sacrifice, and Crystal was the only weapon he had left to protect them with. She took it. One squeeze. Brief. Hard enough to feel the bones beneath the ink. Then she turned and disappeared into the sub-level, and Roh Dae-Jung buttoned his shirt to the collar, straightened his cuffs, and walked out the front door of the vault to surrender. The gala was a spectacle of engineered beauty. 300 of the fashion world's most powerful figures arranged beneath crystal chandeliers in a ballroom that smelled of orchids and old money. Dae-Jung entered through the main doors at 9:47 p.m., crossing the marble floor with the unhurried stride of a man arriving at his own coronation. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The Iron King of the vault, moving through a sea of couture and champagne with the terrifying stillness that made people forget he was a criminal and remember only that he was magnetic. He made it to the center of the ballroom before the tactical teams breached. They came through 4 entry points, simultaneously black-clad figures with helmets and automatic weapons, moving in choreographed formations that turned the ballroom into a kill box in under 8 seconds. Guests screamed. Champagne glasses shattered. A model in a silver gown fainted into the arms of a photographer who was already reaching for his camera. Dae-Jung didn't run. He didn't resist. He stood in the exact center of the chaos with his hands raised and his eyes forward, a calm island in a hurricane of shouting and weapon-mounted flashlights. When they forced him to his knees, he went down with the controlled grace of a man kneeling by choice. When they cuffed his wrists behind his back, he didn't flinch. When a tactical officer pressed a gloved hand against the back of his skull and pushed his face toward the marble, he turned his head to the side and looked directly into the lens of the nearest television camera. He smiled. The feral one. The one with teeth. 300 witnesses. 47 cameras. Every major news outlet in the Western Hemisphere recording the arrest of the most notorious man in the fashion underworld. And 12 blocks south, Crystal Gilmore emerged from a service tunnel into the cold night air of Gansevoort Street and climbed into a black sedan that was already running. She had a window. She intended to use every second of it. The federal convoy left the Metropolitan at 11:30 p.m., 2 armored SUVs flanking a reinforced transport van, running hot with lights and sirens through the wet streets of Lower Manhattan. Rain had started falling an hour earlier, a cold, driving downpour that turned the asphalt into a mirror and reduced visibility to the length of a headlight beam. The convoy moved fast, taking the West Side Highway south toward a high-security federal facility in Brooklyn where Dae-Jung would be processed, interrogated, and buried in the system. Crystal was waiting on the industrial pier at the foot of Pier 57. She had spent the last 3 hours preparing the site with the focused, systematic intensity of a woman building a crime scene in reverse. The pier was a graveyard of commercial equipment, shipping containers, decommissioned loading cranes, and most critically, a heavy-duty lighting rig truck that the vault used for location shoots. The truck weighed 14 tons. Crystal had driven it onto the pier herself, positioning it at a 40-degree angle to the access road, behind a row of shipping containers that concealed it from approaching traffic until the last possible moment. She heard the convoy before she saw it. Sirens cutting through the rain. Then headlights, sweeping across the wet concrete of the pier approach. She waited until the lead SUV was past the containers. Then she released the parking brake, dropped the truck into gear, and drove 14 tons of steel into the side of the armored transport at 35 miles per hour. The impact was cataclysmic. The transport van designed to resist small arms fire. Not a lateral collision from a vehicle that outweighed it by a factor of 3, crumpled inward along its passenger side, and skidded across the rain-slicked pier, shedding sparks and fragments of armored paneling. The lead SUV braked hard, fishtailed, and slammed into a shipping container. The trailing SUV swerved to avoid the wreckage, and came to a stop at an angle that blocked its own exit. Crystal was out of the truck before it stopped moving. She moved through the rain and the wreckage with the brutal efficiency that Dae-Jung had first noticed on the studio floor, low, fast, deliberate. She reached the transport van's rear doors, which had buckled inward from the impact, and wrenched them open with a pry bar she'd staged in advance. Dae-Jung was inside, cuffed to a bench, bleeding from a cut above his left eye where his head had struck the interior wall during the collision. He looked up at her through the blood and the rain and the flashing emergency lights of the wrecked convoy, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was something closer to confirmation, the look of a man who had gambled everything on a woman he barely knew and had just watched the bet pay out in fire and steel. "Took you long enough," he said. She cut his restraints with bolt cutters. He rose, unsteady for a moment, then found his balance with the same fluid control he brought to everything. Around them, federal agents were recovering from the crash, climbing out of damaged vehicles, reaching for weapons, shouting into radios that were already broadcasting emergency codes. Crystal handed Dae-Jung a vest and a comm piece. He put them on without a word. Then she heard the voice. "Crystal." Marcus Webb stepped out of the trailing SUV. He had been riding in the convoy after all, not in the lead vehicle where protocol dictated a senior official would sit, but in the trail car, tucked behind tinted glass where he could oversee the transport without being visible from outside. It was the kind of positioning that revealed everything about the man. Always present, never exposed. Always in control, never accountable. He stood in the rain on the shattered pier, his navy overcoat darkening with water, his silver hair plastered to his skull. His personal sidearm, a bureau-issued Sig Sauer he carried under a discretionary authorization that existed outside the standard weapons log, was in his hand. Not logged, not traceable. A ghost gun carried by a ghost director. "This is over," he said. "Whatever fantasy that man has sold you, whatever conspiracy you think you've uncovered, it ends here. Come in. Come in and I can still fix this. I can get your clearance reinstated. I can make the alert disappear. I can give you back everything you lost." Crystal stood in the rain and looked at the man who had made her career and then unmade her. The man who had taught her to see truth and then weaponized that teaching to conceal his own monstrous lie. The man who had sold 14 women to a consortium that would erase them from the world as thoroughly as he had erased Crystal from the bureau. 8, saved by a mafia boss willing to become a monster. 6 gone swallowed by a pipeline that Marcus had built and fed with the efficiency of a man who understood logistics the way Crystal understood light. She thought about Mireille Duval cutting carrots in a hidden kitchen. She thought about Adaeze Okonkwo carrying folded towels with a smile that meant safety. She thought about the 8 women who were alive because Dae-Jung had decided their lives were worth more than his reputation. And she thought about the 6 she would never meet, the 6 whose faces existed only in case files now, women who had been sold into darkness because Marcus had gotten to them first. She thought about justice. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like a camera lens snapping into focus, that justice and law were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. The law was a system built by people, operated by people, corrupted by people. Justice was something older, something that existed in the space between what the world allowed and what the soul required. Marcus saw the shift in her eyes. He saw the moment she stopped being an agent and became something else, something he hadn't accounted for, something his models couldn't predict. His hand tightened on the weapon. Crystal was faster. Not with a gun. With certainty. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, moving through the rain with a velocity that turned her into a blur against the flashing lights. Marcus fired. The round went wide, panic and rain, and the realization that the woman coming toward him was no longer the protégé he had controlled, but the predator he had created. Crystal closed the gap, caught his gun arm at the wrist at the exact point of maximum leverage, the same institutional technique that had put the paparazzi on the floor of the vault, the same training that Marcus himself had once signed the budget to fund and twisted. The weapon clattered to the wet concrete. Marcus staggered. Crystal didn't let him fall. She held him upright, her face inches from his, and in his eyes she saw the thing she had been trained to identify in every subject she had ever profiled, the final collapse of a man who had run out of moves. She didn't give him a speech. She didn't explain. She delivered the strike the way she did everything, with precision, with efficiency, and with the cold understanding that the 8 women hidden beneath the vault would never be safe as long as the man who had sold them was still breathing. That the 6 already lost would never see justice as long as the architect of their disappearance walked free. It was calculated. It was lethal. And when Marcus Webb's body hit the rain-soaked pier, Crystal Gilmore stood over it with steady hands and a pulse that held at 72 beats per minute. She looked up. Dae-Jung was standing 10 feet away, watching her through the rain. Blood still ran from the cut above his eye. The platinum rings on his fingers were dark with water. His expression held no judgment, no horror, no satisfaction, just recognition. One predator acknowledging another. "We need to move," Crystal said. They moved. The safe house was a converted shipping office on the waterfront in Red Hook, a nondescript brick building wedged between a marine supply warehouse and a shuttered dry dock. Dae-Jung's people had maintained it for years, a bolt hole equipped with communications gear, medical supplies, and enough provisions to sustain 2 people for a month. The windows were blacked out. The doors were reinforced. The building didn't exist on any map that mattered. Crystal cleaned the cut above Dae-Jung's eye with antiseptic from the medical kit, working in silence. Her fingers steady despite the fact that her chest was a continent of bruised tissue beneath the vest she hadn't yet removed. The bullet impact from Marcus's shot at the studio had turned her sternum into a landscape of purple and black that pulsed with each breath. She ignored it. Pain was information. She had been trained to process information, not surrender to it. Dae-Jung sat on the edge of a metal table and let her work without speaking. The safe house was lit by a single overhead bulb that cast hard shadows across the concrete walls. Outside, the rain continued a steady, relentless percussion against the blacked-out windows. Inside, the silence was different from the silences they had shared before. The studio silences had been tactical predator and prey, each measuring the other. This silence was something else. This was the silence of two people sitting in the wreckage of the world they had known, taking inventory of what was left. When Crystal finished with the cut, she stepped back and looked at him. The tattoos on his neck, the sharp line of his jaw, the black-amber eyes that had watched her for 4 months from the throne of the vault, seeing not the cover she had built but the woman underneath it, the profiler, the fighter, the relentless, furious, broken instrument of a justice that no institution had ever been worthy of. "What happens now?" she asked. Dae-Jung reached into the pocket of the vest she had given him on the pier. He produced a small black box, the kind that holds jewelry, but heavier than its size suggested, as if whatever was inside carried a weight that had nothing to do with grams. He opened it. Inside, set against black velvet, was a ring. Not platinum. Not gold. The band was forged from a dark metal she didn't recognize, gunmetal black, brushed to a matte finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Set into the band was a single stone, a black diamond. Not the commercial kind, not the treated stones that jewelers sold to people who wanted to seem edgy. This was a natural carbonado, a raw, uncut black diamond with a surface that looked like compressed night, dense and fathomless, carrying the weight of geological time in a stone no larger than a pea. "In the Giamin," Dae-Jung said, "there is no rank higher than blood, no contract more binding than a blood oath. When two people take the oath, they become equals, not partners, not allies, equals. What one knows, the other knows. What one risks, the other risks. What one kills to protect, the other kills to protect." He held the box out to her. "I am not offering you employment, Crystal. I am not offering you protection. I am offering you a seat at my table, equal authority, equal risk, equal darkness." Crystal looked at the ring, at the black diamond that held no light, at the hands of the man offering it tattooed, scarred, heavy with platinum rings that represented a world she had spent her career trying to dismantle. She thought about the bureau, about the badge she no longer carried and the clearance she no longer held, and the career that had been burned to ash by the man she had just left cooling on a rain-soaked pier. She thought about the law, and about justice, and about the distance between them that she had spent her whole life pretending didn't exist. She thought about 8 women in a hidden corridor, alive because a mafia boss had decided that saving them was worth becoming a monster in the eyes of the world. And 6 more, somewhere in the dark, who were still waiting to be found. Crystal took the ring from the box. She slid it onto her finger. The black diamond sat against her dark skin like a drop of solidified shadow, barely visible, almost weightless, and absolutely final. "Not Agent Gilmore," she said. "Not anymore." Dae-Jung looked at the ring on her hand. Then he looked at her face. The granite expression was still there, the unyielding focus, the profiler's sharp and unforgiving gaze. But something had shifted beneath it. Something had settled into place, the way a bone sets after being broken and reset. The corner of his mouth curved, quiet, real. "Crystal," he said. She met his eyes, held them. 2 predators in a concrete room, bound by a black diamond and a shared enemy that spanned continents and governments and the full dark machinery of institutional power. Outside, the rain hammered Red Hook like a fist, and somewhere across the city, the alert with Crystal Gilmore's name and photograph was still propagating through every law enforcement database in the country. Tomorrow, the world would begin to hunt her. Tomorrow, the Giamin syndicate would learn that their king had taken an outsider as his equal. Tomorrow, the consortium that Marcus Webb had served would discover that their pipeline had been severed, and their architect eliminated, and they would begin to marshal resources that made federal agencies look like local precincts. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in the silence of a Red Hook safe house, two people who had no reason to trust each other and every reason to fight sat on opposite sides of a metal table and began to plan a war. Crystal placed her hands flat on the table. The black diamond ring caught the overhead light and held it, a single dark star burning against the steel surface. "Tell me about the mole," she said. Dae-Jung leaned forward. And in the space between them, in the silence that was no longer tactical and not yet something warmer but was honest ruthlessly, dangerously honest, the next chapter began. Can Crystal's profiler eye see what Dae-Jung's loyal soldiers couldn't, the traitor hiding in plain sight inside his own operation? And what happens when the consortium discovers their architect is dead and comes looking for blood? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss what happens next. This war between a disgraced agent and an international trafficking ring is about to get even more ruthless. Drop a comment, do you think Crystal and Dae-Jung's blood oath can hold when the mole finally reveals themselves? Like this video if you're obsessed with this dangerous alliance between the wolf in the tactical vest and the Iron King who gave her his throne. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for what the mole knows about Crystal's past. See you in the next one, if the Black Diamond survives.